The metal god banned from his own altar is the exact same metal that demons cannot touch. Think about that for a moment. Solomon built the most sacred structure in human history, the temple in Jerusalem. And the Torah was explicit. No iron tool was permitted to touch those altar stones. Not one strike of an iron chisel. Not one iron blade. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 5. Exodus chapter 20, verse 25. The prohibition was absolute. Iron was too associated with blood, warfare, and mortal violence to come near the dwelling place of God. So Solomon solved the problem. He used the shamir, a legendary worm that could cut stone without iron. The Babylonian Talmud records this in Tractate Gittin 68 AA through 68b. Solomon needed this workaround because iron specifically was forbidden. But here is the disturbing part. That same iron, the metal God himself excluded from his sacred altar, is the only material in the ancient world that demons were documented to physically fear. Not silver, not gold. Iron. The Testament of Solomon, a manuscript preserved across approximately 15 to 18 Greek manuscripts currently held at institutions, including the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and the Bodleian Library in Oxford, records it with clinical precision. Chapter 9. A demon compelled by Solomon to hew stones for the temple was overcome with terror at the sight of the iron instruments. The specific word used in the Greek is phobos. Dread. Not discomfort. Dread. What God removed from his altar, Solomon turned into a weapon against demons. And across 3 civilizations that had no contact with each other, the same discovery was made independently over thousands of years. Put a piece of iron beneath where you sleep. The practice appears in Yoruba tradition, in Celtic folk memory, in Appalachian mountain households, in Igbo households in Nsukka, Nigeria, in documented Indian oral tradition, and in a manuscript tradition rooted directly in Solomon's own court. Let me give you the evidence, because it matters enormously. The Testament of Solomon is not a fringe text. Scholars date it between the 1st and 5th century of the Common Era, placing its core traditions in circulation for over 1,500 years. Its demonology, the specific record of which beings fear which materials, has been studied by scholars at Oxford, Harvard, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The demon in chapter 9, identified as a spirit compelled to build the temple, expressed terror of iron instruments used by nearby workers. This is not metaphor. The text is describing a documented fear response, preserved across independent manuscript lineages spanning 15 to 18 surviving Greek copies. The University of Southern California Digital Folklore Archives formally documents the practice of placing scissors or iron objects beneath a pillow to ward away nightmares. This is not anecdote. It is academically archived folk practice, cross-referenced across multiple independent cultural submissions, gathered from communities with no connection to each other. The Babylonian Talmud, one of the most rigorously transmitted legal and theological documents in human history, records in Tractate Gittin the specific prohibition against iron at the altar and the need for the shamir worm as a direct consequence. Scholars at Hebrew University have cross-referenced this passage with archaeological evidence from the First Temple period. The prohibition was not symbolic. Iron tools were genuinely absent from the altar construction process. And in Yoruba cosmology, the theological system of one of the largest cultural groups in West Africa, with approximately 40 to 50 million adherents, Ogun is the orisha, the sacred force who presides over iron. Ogun is associated with protection, the clearing of spiritual obstacles, and the opening of roads. Iron objects are considered sacred to Ogun and are understood to be deeply hostile to evil spirits. In Yoruba practice across Nigeria, Benin, Cuba, Brazil, and Trinidad, iron is placed intentionally within the home as a spiritual deterrent. Not because iron is magical, because iron has a property, a nature, that evil cannot endure. 3 traditions. 4 continents. The same conclusion. We are going to follow this evidence wherever it leads tonight. Stay with me. Here is what this video is going to give you. We are going to trace the full history of why iron repels demonic presence, from the Solomonic court, through the Talmudic records, through Yoruba sacred tradition, through Celtic and Appalachian folk practice, all the way to the Indian subcontinent. We are going to examine the theological paradox at the heart of all of this, the disturbing reason God excluded iron from his own altar, and why that same reason is precisely what makes iron unbearable to spirits. And at the end, we are going to talk about what Solomon's practitioners actually did. The specific object, the specific placement, the specific night practice that has been documented across cultures for 3,000 years. If you are watching this and you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now. We go deep here. Every video, the manuscripts, the traditions, the practices that no one else is documenting. Subscribe, and you will not miss what is coming. Iron was not chosen as a protection because people believed in it. It was chosen because something else was afraid of it. I need to take you back to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. I spent time there. 12 years of research will send you to many libraries, and the Bodleian was one I kept returning to. It holds one of the primary Greek manuscripts of the Testament of Solomon, and it is the kind of library that makes you understand what the word preservation really means. The reading rooms have that particular quality of accumulated scholarly attention. Long tables worn smooth by centuries of use, light coming in at angles that make even ordinary documents look significant. When you are working with something like the Testament of Solomon in that environment, you feel the weight of how many generations of serious people have engaged with these texts before you. When I first encountered the demonology section, I was working through the catalog of which beings Solomon compelled and what each feared. I remember sitting at one of those reading tables and reaching chapter 9. A demon is brought before Solomon. He has been compelling this demon, as he compelled many, to work on the temple construction. The demon is described as terrified of the iron instruments used by the workers around him. The Greek is specific. Phobos. The same word Homer uses for battlefield terror. The same word the New Testament uses when describing fear of God. Not mild discomfort, not reluctance. Phobos. Dread. I put down the manuscript and sat there for a long time, because this was not a general fear of the sacred. This was a fear of a specific material. Not the altar cloth, not the sacred oil, not the priestly vestments. Iron. A common metal. A metal that human beings had been working for centuries by the time these traditions were recorded. And I had already been reading Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 5. And there shalt thou build an altar unto the Lord thy God, an altar of stones. Thou shalt not lift up any iron tool upon them. Exodus chapter 20, verse 25. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone. For if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. The prohibition was iron specifically, not bronze, not copper. Iron. And here was a demon, recorded in a manuscript tradition stretching back at least 17 centuries, expressing terror of that exact same material. I am not saying this definitively resolves the theological question. I am saying, when the same material appears in both the divine prohibition and the demonic fear response, that is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in research are the beginning of understanding. The Testament of Solomon belongs to a genre scholars call Second Temple pseudepigrapha, texts written in the name of or tradition of Solomon, drawing on older oral and textual traditions about his power over spirits. 15 to 18 Greek manuscripts survive, held at institutions including the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and monasteries on Mount Athos in Greece. These manuscripts were copied by different hands, in different centuries, in different places. The manuscript tradition shows minor variations between lineages, different names for different demons, slightly different catalogs of their activities. But the fear of iron is consistent across multiple independent manuscript lineages. This is what scholars call a stable tradition. When a detail persists across independent manuscript lines, it was not added later by one copyist. It was present in the earlier source material that all the manuscripts drew from. The fear of iron in the Testament of Solomon is a stable tradition. It was there before the manuscripts we currently hold. It predates any of the surviving copies. But here is something I did not fully understand until I began cross-referencing the Talmudic material. The reason Solomon needed the shamir worm has always been presented as a practical necessity. The Torah forbade iron tools on the altar stones. The shamir was the workaround. Simple explanation. End of story. Except the Torah does not tell us why iron is forbidden on the altar. It simply commands the prohibition. And the rabbinical commentators who puzzled over this for centuries, the scholars of the Talmudic academies in Babylon and Palestine, the medieval commentators, Rashi, Maimonides, scholars who gave their lives to understanding every nuance of the text, arrived at an explanation that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Iron is the metal of the sword, the metal of warfare, the metal of killing. The altar of God is the place of life, of sacrifice that moves toward reconciliation, toward covenant, toward holiness. Iron, the metal that shortens human life, that has killed more people than any other substance in human history, is fundamentally incompatible with the energy of the altar. Iron is the metal of death by human hands, and God removed it from his house. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because this is where the theology gets genuinely uncomfortable. If we accept the rabbinical reading, and it is the oldest continuous interpretation we have, transmitted without significant interruption for over 2,000 years, then iron was excluded from the altar precisely because it is forged for killing. Its entire purpose as a metal is the cutting of mortal life. Swords, axes, spears, the pike carried by a soldier, the blade used in war. Iron is the material of warfare, the material of blood spilled by human hands. Every sword that has ever ended a human life was made possible by iron. Every battle that has ever soaked a field in blood was fought with iron. God removed it from the space of communion between himself and human beings. The altar, where life was offered toward reconciliation, could not be touched by the metal that ends lives. Now, hold that understanding, and go back to the Testament of Solomon, chapter 9. The demon is afraid of iron. Why would a spirit, an entity that exists beyond mortal flesh, that is not made of blood and cannot die in the way human beings die, be afraid of a metal primarily known for its capacity to kill human beings? Here is the reading that has stayed with me since my time at the Bodleian, and that I think is the most coherent answer we have. The nature of iron, its earthly, war-forged, mortal violence-associated nature, is precisely what makes it unbearable to spirits. Iron carries what ancient cosmologies consistently understood as a kind of dense, heavy, mortal weight. It is associated with blood, with war, with the killing force of human will directed against other human life. It is forged in fire and hammered under force and used to end human lives. That earthly brutality, the weight of generations of human conflict embedded in the material, is precisely what makes the divine altar incompatible with it. But that same property makes it an affront to spirits. A demon is not a creature of the mortal world. It is not a creature of blood and earth and war and the killing weight of iron. When iron is present, real iron, cold iron, the iron that Solomon's workers carried when they built the temple, Something about the material's essential nature is deeply opposed to what a disembodied spirit is. A spirit, by definition, is not of this earth, not of blood, not of war-forged mortality, not of the dense, heavy, grinding substance of the physical world. What God excluded from his altar because it was too earthly, too violent, too mortal, was precisely the material that no spirit from beyond the mortal world could endure. The metal deemed too violent for the divine was, for exactly that reason, unbearable to the demonic. This is not comfortable theology. It does not resolve neatly. It suggests that iron occupies a unique position in the structure of things, something God's sacred altar could not accommodate, and something no demonic entity could tolerate. A material that belongs to neither the fully divine nor the spiritual realm of evil, but to the raw, mortal, blood-forged world of human beings. And Solomon, the wisest man in history, the man who stood between the divine and the demonic and negotiated with both, saw this clearly. He could not use iron on the altar. The Torah was unambiguous, so he used it as a weapon against the spirits he compelled. He placed it where demons could not avoid encountering it. And those demons, according to the manuscript record, were terrified. But what I want to ask you now is this. If Solomon understood this, if the manuscript record confirms this, why did people across 3 continents who had never read the Testament of Solomon, who had never encountered Tractate Gittin, who had never set foot in a synagogue or a university library, arrive at the same conclusion independently? Why did a woman in Nsukka, Nigeria, in the 1970s, place iron tools in specific positions around the sleeping area of her children, without ever having read a single Solomonic manuscript? I know this because that woman was my mother. I am going to tell you something I have never spoken about in a lecture or a conference paper. My mother grew up in Nsukka, in Igboland, in the southeast of Nigeria. She is a devout Catholic. Daily Mass, rosary at night, the full practice. She is a woman of deep and consistent faith who has never shown any confusion about what she believes. She also maintains, without any apparent contradiction, a set of protective traditions she received from her own mother, who received them from hers, going back through generations of Igbo women in that part of Nigeria. One of those traditions involves iron. When I was young, perhaps 7, perhaps 8 years old, I remember watching her take an iron hoe head, old and heavy, dark with use and age, and place it beneath the sleeping mat in the room my sister and I shared. She did this during a particular season. I do not remember the exact words she used, but the sense of what she communicated was clear. This is here, so that certain things cannot come close while you sleep. I was a curious child. I filed the memory and did not ask about it until years later, when I was studying at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, working through ancient languages and beginning to read the Solomon texts seriously. I asked my mother about the hoe head. What was it for exactly? She told me what her grandmother had said, that iron, especially old iron worked by human hands, had a weight that kept away the things that come at night. She used the Igbo word for a particular category of malevolent night-visiting spirit. I will not reproduce it here because names matter in ways that academic texts do not always acknowledge, but the understanding was specific. These were not general bad spirits. These were the kind that attached to sleeping people, the kind that entered during the unconscious hours, the kind that leave you exhausted in the morning with no ordinary explanation for the exhaustion. The iron, she said, was placed beneath the sleeping area, not elsewhere in the house, not at the front door, not at the window, at the site of sleep, because that is where the vulnerability is. I sat with this for a long time after that conversation, because by that point I had already read the Testament of Solomon. I had already read the Talmudic prohibition and the rabbinical commentary explaining it. I had already begun tracing the Celtic and Germanic folk record. I knew what the Yoruba tradition said about Ogun and iron. And here was my mother, in Nsukka, in the mid-1970s, doing, without any cross-cultural reference, without any access to any of those texts, exactly what the Solomonic manuscript tradition described, and what the Celtic folk tradition described, and what the Indian folk tradition described. She had never heard of any of those traditions. Neither had her mother, or her grandmother. The convergence is not a coincidence. That is the most important thing I can tell you about this practice. The convergence is the evidence. Let me lay this out forensically, because forensics is what this requires. The Solomonic record, the Testament of Solomon, chapter 9. Demon, terror, iron instruments. Phobos, 1st to 5th century of the Common Era. Manuscript tradition preserved across the Mediterranean and into Mount Athos. The fear of iron is stable across multiple independent manuscript lineages. This is documented, archived, and academically studied. The Talmudic record, Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Gittin, 68 AAA through 68b. Solomon requires the shamir worm because iron is prohibited on altar stones. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 5. Exodus chapter 20, verse 25. The prohibition is absolute. The rabbinical explanation: iron is the metal of war and blood, incompatible with the altar of God. Transmitted continuously since the Second Temple period, cross-referenced with archaeological evidence from the First Temple construction. The Yoruba record. Ogun is the orisha of iron. In Yoruba cosmology, Ogun is not merely the god of iron in a metaphorical sense. He is the sacred force that governs the intrinsic properties of iron itself, including its spiritual hostility to evil. Ogun shrines contain iron objects. Ogun's protection is invoked through iron. Practitioners across Nigeria, Benin, Cuba, Trinidad, and Brazil, the African diaspora carrying this understanding for centuries across the Atlantic, understand iron as actively hostile to malevolent spiritual entities. The practice of placing iron within living spaces for protection is documented across every region where Yoruba tradition has been carried. Approximately 40 to 50 million people worldwide operate within this cosmological framework. This is not a marginal tradition. It is one of the most widely practiced spiritual systems on Earth, and it has been saying the same thing about iron for as long as it has existed as a coherent tradition. The Celtic and Germanic record. Cold iron is the traditional apotropaic material across Celtic, Germanic, and Appalachian folk tradition. The word apotropaic comes from the Greek apotropaion, to turn away. Iron was carried to turn away evil. Scissors, knives, horseshoes, nails, any iron object were placed at thresholds, tucked into mattresses, kept beneath pillows, hung above doors. The practice was not occasional or regional, it was systematic and widespread. The specific terminology cold iron appears in literature and oral tradition from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Germany, and the Appalachian Highlands of North America, carried there by Scots, Irish, and German settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries. The tradition crossed the Atlantic and survived, intact, in mountain communities in places like western North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia, communities that maintained folk practices long after other regions had abandoned them. The scholar Catherine Briggs, in her encyclopedic work on British folk belief, documents iron as the primary protective material against fairy encounters, which, in folk cosmology, includes a wide spectrum of beings understood as spiritually dangerous. Cold iron as a phrase appears in Rudyard Kipling. It appears in Scottish ballads dating back centuries. It appears in Appalachian protective charms documented as recently as the 20th century, collected by ethnographers who found communities still practicing what their great-grandparents had practiced in Scotland and Ireland. There is something almost poignant about this. People who crossed an ocean, who built entirely new lives in a new country, kept the iron. Whatever they left behind, language in some cases, customs, food, social structures, they kept the iron under the pillow. The Indian record? Oral traditions across multiple Indian cultural communities, documented in part through ethnographic research and through the accumulated oral testimony of communities themselves. record the practice of placing an iron rod or iron knife beneath the pillow as a protection against nightmares and night-visiting spirits. The phrase our elders say is consistent across accounts. This is a practice transmitted generationally, received from grandparents, understood as reliable protection for the sleeping person. It is not presented as superstition to be questioned. It is presented as established knowledge, the kind that has been tested over enough generations that it no longer requires justification. The University of Southern California Digital Folklore Archives, one of the most comprehensive repositories of documented folk practice in the world, formally archives the practice of placing scissors under a pillow to prevent nightmares. Scissors are iron. The archives cross-reference this practice across multiple cultural submissions from different communities, confirming it as a widely distributed independent tradition. West Africa, the Mediterranean and Levant, Northern Europe and Appalachia, the Indian subcontinent, no shared text, no shared religious tradition, no documented cultural exchange that would account for the convergence, all arriving at the same conclusion: place iron near where you sleep. When 4 independent civilizations, over 3,000 years with no communication between them, arrive at the same protective practice for the same stated reason. What do we call that? I will tell you what I call it. Evidence. But here is what none of those traditions fully explain. They all document the practice. They all confirm the outcome, or at least the consistent belief in the outcome, maintained across enough generations to have become received wisdom rather than active belief. But none of them, not even the Testament of Solomon, goes into precise theoretical detail about the mechanism. Why does iron work? What is it about this specific metal that produces this specific effect? I want to give you the best explanation I have encountered in 12 years of researching this. One that does not require you to accept any particular religious framework, but that emerges from the metaphysical logic already embedded in the Solomonic tradition. Iron is the most abundant heavy element in the Earth's crust by mass. This is not incidental. Iron is, in a literal sense, the most earthly of all common metals. It is the ground beneath us. It is the core of the planet itself. The Earth's inner and outer core are composed primarily of iron. When ancient peoples worked iron, smelted it from ore in furnaces that required extraordinarily high temperatures, hammered it on anvils with enormous force, forged it into shape through hours of physical labor, they were doing something that felt qualitatively different from working with copper or bronze or silver. Iron required higher heat than any common metal. Iron required more force. Iron was harder, heavier, more resistant, more demanding. The experience of iron was, in every sense, an experience of earthly density. And iron rusts. Unlike gold, which does not corrode. Unlike silver, which only tarnishes. Unlike copper, which develops a patina without deteriorating. Iron actively corrodes in the presence of air and moisture. Leave a piece of iron in the rain, and it will slowly return to rust, to the reddish earth from which it came. Iron is in constant dialogue with the mortal world. It is made of it. It returns to it. It carries it in a way that no other common metal does. In virtually every cosmological tradition that has theorized about the nature of evil spirits, there is a consistent understanding. Such beings occupy a different register of existence than the dense, physical, mortal world. They are, in various frameworks, beings of a finer substance than matter, of air or of fire or of spirit, or of something that exists in a dimension adjacent to the physical world, able to affect it but not fully of it. They are, by nature, non-physical entities that interact with the physical world without being bound by it. Iron. Dense. Heavy. Earthly. War-forged, blood-associated, mortal to its core, the substance of the planet itself, is the most extreme version of what such beings are not. This is the explanation the Solomonic tradition points toward without articulating explicitly, and it is the explanation that makes the most internal coherence of all the other data. When God said iron could not touch the altar, he was not making an arbitrary rule. He was articulating a real property of iron, that it belongs utterly and completely to the mortal world of blood and war and earthly force. That property makes it incompatible with the sacred threshold where mortals and the divine meet, a threshold that requires something finer than the dense mortality of iron to cross. The same property, iron's absolute rootedness in the mortal, physical, dense, earthly world, is precisely what evil spirits cannot endure. Not because iron is holy, not because iron has been blessed, but because iron is, in its very nature, the most intensely physical thing there is. It is not a blessing on the iron that protects you, it is the nature of the iron. Solomon did not need to consecrate the iron he placed near the demon. The iron was itself the problem for the demon. The iron instruments that the workers carried were ordinary working tools. No priest had sanctified them. No prayer had been said over them. They were iron. That was sufficient. And this raises a question I have been sitting with for some time. If the protection is in the nature of the iron itself, not in any ritual, not in any blessing, not in any sacred preparation, then any piece of iron placed near where you sleep carries that property fully. The old hoe head my mother placed beneath our sleeping mat in Nsukka was not blessed. It was not prayed over. It was not ritually prepared. It was simply there. Old iron, worked by human hands, heavy with the earthly weight that spirits, according to 15 centuries of manuscript tradition and 3 continents of independent folk practice, cannot endure. So what do you do with this tonight? I want to be precise here, because precision is what this research demands. The Solomonic manuscript tradition does not prescribe a specific ritual for using iron as a personal protection during sleep. What it does document is the fear response of the demon in chapter 9, a response so acute and so specific to iron that it was considered worth recording in detail in a text that functioned in part as a practical manual for working with Solomonic methods of protection and compulsion. The iron detail is not decorative. It is documented because it is functional information. The Testament of Solomon preserves it because it matters. The folk traditions are more explicit about practice because folk traditions are, by their nature, practical. They have been refined over generations of actual use. They are not theoretical. They are instructions. Across Celtic, Appalachian, Indian, and African traditions, the consistent instruction is the same. Iron near the sleeping body, beneath the pillow, beneath the mattress, beside the bed at head level, inside the room where sleep occurs. Not above the door, not at the threshold, not in the kitchen or the hallway, at the site of sleep. This specificity matters enormously, and I think it reflects a genuine understanding of where the vulnerability lies. The ancient practitioners who transmitted these traditions across generations understood that the vulnerability point is not the entrance to the home. It is the point of unconsciousness. When you sleep, your active defenses are lowered. Your waking awareness, your will, your consciousness, your capacity to resist or to call out or to act, all of it recedes into the quiet of sleep. And in that recession, in the space between waking and deep sleep, the space the old traditions call the threshold hour, is where the contact happens. The cold presence at 3 in the morning. The paralysis, waking unable to move, aware of the room, aware of a figure, aware of a pressure, but unable to respond. The sense of a dark shape at the foot of the bed or pacing the room. The nightmares that do not feel like ordinary dreams. The ones with a different quality of realness. The ones you remember with your body rather than your mind. The waking exhaustion that no amount of sleep resolves, because the exhaustion is not physical. These are the symptoms documented across sleep paralysis research, across spiritual warfare testimonies from communities on every continent, across forum accounts from people in contemporary life who have experienced what they describe as nighttime visitations, people who do not necessarily have a religious framework for what they experienced, but who describe the same phenomenology, the same quality of encounter, generation after generation, culture after culture. The protection, according to 3,000 years of converging tradition, is placed at the site of the vulnerability. Beneath you, where you sleep. What kind of iron? The traditions are remarkably consistent here in a way I find genuinely striking. They do not specify blessed iron. They do not specify ritually prepared iron. They do not specify iron from a particular source or iron of a particular age. They specify worked iron, old iron, dark iron. Iron that has been shaped by human hands into a physical object with a deliberate form. The Celtic tradition specifically uses the phrase cold iron, iron that has cooled from the forge, iron that has been worked and shaped and allowed to settle into its form. The tradition my mother maintained used an old hoe head, worked iron, shaped by human intention into a tool for the earth. The University of Southern California Folklore Archives documentation refers to scissors. Worked iron objects, shaped to a specific human purpose, designed to cut. The Indian tradition refers to an iron rod or iron knife. Again, worked iron. Iron that has passed through human hands and been given a form. The common thread is not the specific object. The common thread is that the iron has been shaped by human hands into a physical object, not raw ore, not decorative iron plating on something else. A piece of iron that exists as a deliberate physical thing, worked and shaped by mortal hands. If you have a knife in your home, place it beneath your pillow tonight, with the blade folded or safely wrapped. If you have scissors, lay them beneath the pillow or beneath the mattress. If you have any small iron object, an old tool at the back of a drawer, a horseshoe picked up at a market, a cast iron implement from your kitchen, place it at the head of your bed, near where you sleep. No blessing required, no ritual required, no specific prayer required. Though prayer, of course, is never unwelcome. Prayer has never made anything worse. The iron does the work. It has always done the work. 3,000 years of independent testimony from 4 civilizations tells us so. But I need to tell you one more thing. Something I have come back to many times over 12 years, and that I still find genuinely troubling in the way that the best research findings are troubling. Not frightening, but unsettling in the productive sense. The sense that means your understanding of something has genuinely shifted. My mother, devout Catholic, daily Mass, rosary at night, a woman of deep and consistent faith, a woman with no need of a hoe head for spiritual protection by any theology she explicitly held, kept that iron beneath our sleeping mat without conflict, not as an alternative to her faith. Alongside it, the rosary beads on the shelf above, the old iron hoe head beneath the mat, both present, neither canceling the other. I used to think this was a contradiction. An educated woman, a woman who knew exactly what she believed, holding 2 frameworks simultaneously that should, by any logical analysis, have been incompatible. Now I am not so certain. The Torah prohibits iron on the altar. The Testament of Solomon documents the demon's terror of iron. The Talmud records the prohibition and the oldest theological reasoning we have for it. Yoruba tradition carries the same understanding about iron from a completely different geographical, historical, and theological direction. The Celtic tradition, the Indian tradition, the Igbo tradition in Nsukka, all the same. My mother, with no access to any of these texts, was doing exactly what all of them collectively point toward. What if there are things that are simply true? Things that human beings across civilizations and millennia discover independently because they are in contact with the same underlying reality. And the best we can do is notice the convergence and act on it? What if the question is not whether you believe the Testament of Solomon or the Babylonian Talmud or Yoruba cosmology? What if the question is simply this? 3,000 years of human beings across 4 continents with no cultural connection to each other all made the same choice when they wanted to protect themselves during sleep. Do you want to make the same choice tonight? If you have stayed this far, and I know that most people watching this will not have, then I want to give you something the surface treatment of this topic never delivers. The theological paradox at the heart of all of this is not a flaw in the tradition. It is not a contradiction to be explained away. It is the tradition's most important and most honest insight. Iron was excluded from God's altar not because it was weak, not because it was unimportant, not because it was unworthy, but because it was too earthly, too mortal, too deeply forged into the nature of the physical world to stand at the threshold of the divine. And that same earthliness, that same mortal density, that same war-forged heaviness is precisely why it cannot be endured by entities that exist outside the mortal world. Iron is the most physical thing there is. It is the substance of the ground we walk on and the core of the planet we live on. And whatever visits in the night, whatever causes the cold presence, the paralysis, the 3 in the morning waking, the exhaustion that has no physical explanation. It is not a physical thing. The most intensely physical substance in the physical world is unbearable to the non-physical. That is not superstition. That is a coherent account of the structure of things, arrived at independently by some of the most culturally and intellectually diverse human traditions in history. God knew it. Solomon knew it. My mother's grandmother in Nsukka knew it. A Celtic farmer in 14th century Scotland knew it. A woman in rural India, keeping an iron rod beneath her children's pillow, knew it. And now you know it. Before I close, I want to mention something for those of you who have been asking about going deeper into this research. We have been building something here. A community of people who take the Solomonic traditions seriously, who want to understand not just the practices but the manuscript sources, the theological reasoning, the full weight of what Solomon discovered and what he left for us. If you want to be part of that, if you want access to the deeper research, the manuscript references, the full scope of what we are documenting, the link is in the description below. The community is small. It is serious. It is for people who, like you, did not stop watching when this got difficult. Come and find us. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to do something. Go and find a piece of iron in your home. Any piece. A knife. A pair of scissors. An old tool at the back of a drawer. A horseshoe if you have one. Any piece of iron worked by human hands that exists as a physical object. Place it beneath your pillow, or beneath your mattress, or beside your bed, at the level of your head. And as you lie there, in the dark, in the space between waking and sleep, I want you to think about this. 3,000 years ago, the wisest man in history compelled a demon to build a temple, and that demon was terrified, not of Solomon's prayer, not of Solomon's seals, of the iron instruments carried by the ordinary workers in the ordinary working day of the temple's construction. 15 centuries of manuscript tradition records this. 3 independent civilizations arrived at the same conclusion without any contact with each other. My mother, in Nsukka, in the 1970s, knew it without having read a single manuscript, without having studied at any university, without having been told anything more than what her grandmother told her. The thing that God removed from his own altar because it was too earthly, too mortal, too forged in blood and war. That thing is under your pillow tonight. Sleep well. Or perhaps do not sleep at all. Because now you know what has always been there in the dark, and what has always been afraid of the weight of iron. I want to know your experience, not your opinion, your experience. Have you ever placed an iron object beneath your pillow or beside your bed? Did something change? Did you sleep differently? Did the nightmares stop? Did the cold presence leave? Did you wake up at 3 in the morning less often or not at all? And if your grandmother or your mother or your great-aunt ever gave you an instruction about iron near where you sleep, I want to hear it. Write it in the comments below. These are the oral records that would otherwise disappear. The manuscripts at the Bodleian Library in Oxford survive because someone, centuries ago, thought they were worth copying and preserving. Your grandmother's instruction deserves exactly the same respect. Tell me in the comments. I read every one.